It's the third lesson of the Software Development Learning Outcome 3 unit, ASCII and fixed and conditional loops. So this is the two functions adding on to the 6 from the previous lesson, and this is Friday the 13th of January 2020. There's two functions which are concerned with ASCII conversion from number to character and vice versa. The first one is CHR, and what that does is it takes an integer ASCII code and turns it into a string character. Here's an example. So CHR 65, the ASCII code for the ASCII code 65 is the character capital A. So what CHR 65 does is returns a single string character A to the function or procedure or message box that's calling it. Now the reverse of this is ASC, and that's is short for ASCII, and this converts a string character to an integer ASCII code. And so what you do is you pass in a single character. It only works with individual characters. If you passed in, say, a string that said hello, it would either crash or only convert the first letter, and that returns 65. So if you were, for example, working out a cipher wheel or doing some encryption code, you could convert individual characters from a message into their ASCII codes, add or subtract some values from it, and then use the CHR function to convert that code back into a character. The main body of the lesson today is about the difference between fixed and conditional loops. And what a fixed loop does is it will execute a set number of times and then end. And you can see the example on the left, the pseudocode in blue and the Visual Basic in the dark grey. What this program does is loop 10 times and just display hello. So you end up with 10 hello messages on your screen, in this case in a list box. So fixed loops are for when you know the length of a string, for example, or the length of a collection of values, or you want to run for a set number of passengers on an aeroplane or number of pupils in a class. You can hard code them, or you can hard code the loop so that it only runs a set number of times. Now, the comparison between fixed loops and conditional loops is, while fixed loops will execute a set number of times and then stop, the conditional loop, and in this case it's a do loop, will execute an infinite number of times and only end when an expression is true. So I've used the same program, but I've turned it into a do loop. And what I've done here is slightly wrong. It should have been set x to 0 to begin with, to make it display hello 10 times. This only displays hello 9 times in this example. But what we're doing here is we are setting up our variable to count. We're then going into the loop, step 2, we're denoting the start of the loop using do, and in step 3 we're displaying hello, in this case in a message box. We're adding 1 to the counter x, and then we're checking at the bottom. So step 5 is the first time where the expression is actually compared. So this means that the code within a do loop until loop will run at least once, because it will have to go through step 1, 2, 3 and 4 before it does its comparison to decide whether it will return to step 2 or whether it will drop out of the program altogether. And remember, the Visual Basic on the right hand side is just to give you some pointers if you were creating your own conditional loop. The second type of conditional loop is a while loop, and this will execute an infinite number of times like the last one and end when the expression is true. The difference here is when the expression is actually evaluated, and in this case the while loop starts at step 2, ends at step 5, but the condition is tested, evaluated at step 2. So there's a potential here to actually get to step 2, decide that the loop is not required, and drop straight out of the program. In this case, of course, it won't, because it's going to display hello 10 times. But if you were, say, comparing some user input, so if you asked them to enter a value between 5 and 18, for example, and if they enter 10, that would be within the valid range. So one method of using a while loop would be to evaluate to see whether the user input is outside of a range, and if it's outside of a range, display an error message and ask for the value again. That's input validation. That's one of the standard algorithms. So a while loop is very useful if you want to check for errors or check if a value is out with a particular range. A do loop will run the code first and then potentially drop out or loop back. But the difference between a fixed loop and a conditional loop is that the fixed loop run for a predefined number of times. Conditional loop will run until an expression is met.